Mop-up operations are underway in the Western Cape following those devastating floods over the long weekend. In the Eastern Cape, response team remain on high alert as that province is on a level 6 warning for heavy rains, including winds and abnormal waves up until this evening. Wits University physical geography professor Jasper Knight joining us now to give us some analysis of what we're seeing in our weather patterns. Prof, good morning to you and thank you for your time. So, a simple question to start our conversation. What is driving the latest flooding in South Africa, particularly along the coastal areas?
Yes, well, good morning to you. And the reason why we have these particular events over this last weekend or so is really the outcome of a particular type of weather system. And this is called a cut-off low. And what this refers to is where we have a pocket of cold air in the upper atmosphere that is captured by waves that take place in air circulation in the upper atmosphere. And this cut-off low then kind of communicates to the ground surface. And in so doing, it reflects atmospheric instability. So air moving up and down. And the result of that is the formation of big storms, and associated with those big storms, we have high winds and lots of rain. And that's the major mechanism giving rise to these, really intense flood events that we've seen along the south coast. And this is a typical part of our ordinary weather patterns.
Very interesting. So a combination of factors. Here's another question for you. A storm surge versus a spring tide. What's the difference between the two and what are we experiencing?
Well, what we've experienced over this last weekend is actually neither of those. So a week or so ago, we had some strong storms affecting the south coast. And here that was associated with low pressure cells generated over the ocean and making their way towards the land. And that was associated with what is termed a storm surge. And this is simply where the elevation of the ocean surface temporarily rises up beneath the eye of the low pressure cell, and then that can give enhanced coastal flooding. So into those situations, here, of course, we don't just get a higher sea level, we also get strong winds and big waves. And it was also the big waves that came on shore that gave rise to lots of flooding. And the interesting thing about a week or so ago with these storms is that the period of this storm also then coincided with a period of high spring tides. So here we had a critical combination of different things that gave rise to very high amounts of coastal flooding. So it was the combination, the coincidence of these events. And these are actually different to what we've seen in the same region over the last couple of days.
Are these predictable, Professor? And I ask that because people ought to be forewarned about such weather events so that we take care.
Well, the answer is yes, they are pretty much predictable because, of course, we have weather forecasting. And so, of course, we can predict what the weather's going to be like, maybe up to a week in advance or so, and we can track the development of these low pressure cells. However, of course, one thing that we can't predict are the exact impacts of these storms and cut-off lows on the land surface. So very often we know where they're going to take place, but we don't necessarily know how big they're going to be. Yeah. And of course, we don't know what impacts there might be upon the land surface. And this is where communication with local municipalities and local communities is actually needed. So if there is a danger of significant flooding, then local people need to be warned, and we need to have a disaster management plan in place. And that's been the situation over the last couple of days.
Talk to us more about those emergency measures. Yes, when the storm is here, kind of difficult to sort of plan around it. But if perhaps there are plans in place, maybe you're able to mitigate this sort of impact, particularly on human lives.
Yes, that's correct. And municipalities do have these plans in place because this is actually a statutory requirement under the Disaster Management Act. So we do have these plans in place at the local level. But an important thing to also identify is the fact that these events are very quickly changing. And what might be happening or what might be important in 1 hour might be less important in another hour. So really, we actually need municipalities to be very nimble in terms of how they respond to these events, and also that they communicate with local communities and stakeholders, and often they don't do that very effectively. What we also need to ensure, however, is that where possible, people and assets, such as people's cars and this kind of thing, are actually removed from the areas that are sensitive to flooding. And what we've seen in the news in the last few days or so is lots of people have actually gone to the coast to watch the big waves. So, of course, here they're putting themselves in danger. So here, a simple action to take would be to prevent people coming into coastal car parks to look at the big waves, because that's actually making things worse rather than better.
Yeah. Final question to you. How long does the water that stays almost stagnant around people's homes, how long does it take for that water to basically subside? Or does the emergency teams or your disaster management teams, are they the people responsible for redirecting that water?
Yes, well, to answer the last part first, yes, there should be responsibility of disaster management teams to kind of mitigate against the negative impacts of these events and to reduce water, especially standing water covering highways and so on, which is of course dangerous. But equally, many of these storm events themselves are only present for a couple of days, but the actual impacts on the land surface could last for a long time. And basically, the sooner that we can make good those impacts, the easier it is for everyone to get back to normal, which is, of course, what we want. But, of course, the more quickly and effectively that local municipalities can get into gear, the sooner they are able to tackle this damage.
Professor Jasper Knight, let me thank you very much for your time and insights here. He is a geoscientist attached to the University of Witwatersrand.